This is an extraordinary story, a love story, if you will, with a dramatic plot which includes a nocturnal elopement, a secret marriage, and 2 bloody duels. It is a tale of 2 families, the Linleys and the Sheridans, and the leading characters are Elizabeth Linley and Richard Brinsley Sheridan. Thomas Linley is the leading musician in Bath in the 1760s, early 1770s. He is a virtuoso on the harpsichord, a composer and a leading musical teacher. When the new assembly rooms are opened in 1771, Thomas is appointed as director of music. He and his wife Mary have 12 children, of whom 8 survive infancy, and those 8 children are all trained as musicians and singers. They're known as a nest of nightingales. They were the Von Trapps of the 18th century. There was a son also called Thomas, who was a child prodigy on the violin. He was sent off to Italy to train as a youth, and it was in Florence that he met Mozart and became a close friend. He was all set for a glittering career as a composer, but tragically he died at the age of 22 in a boating accident. But perhaps the most celebrated of all the Linley children was the eldest, Elizabeth. She was regarded as having the finest soprano voice of her generation. She performed as a young girl. She made her Covent Garden debut at the age of 13, and her father made a considerable amount of money, the proceeds from her concerts. She was also universally acknowledged as being extremely beautiful. The Bishop of Meath described her as being the link between angel and woman. She was painted on numerous occasions by Thomas Gainsborough and by Joshua Reynolds. Now, the Linleys initially lived in Abbey Green. They then moved to 1 Pierpont Place, Linley House as we now know it, much beloved of many an ASC alum. And when the family bank balances started to improve, thanks to Elizabeth's concerts, the family moved upmarket. They moved uptown to number 11 Royal Crescent. Now, the Sheridans were Irish. Thomas Sheridan was an actor. He was the manager of the Smock Alley Theatre in Dublin, and he moved his family to England in 1758. They moved to Bath in the autumn of 1770, and Thomas's intention was to open an academy for elocution and rhetoric. Now, the Sheridans knew the Linleys from previous visits to Bath, and on their arrival, the Linleys invited them to a small musical party. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall on that occasion. And the Linley children and the Sheridan children became friendly. And in fact, the 2 Sheridan boys, Charles and Richard, both fell in love with Elizabeth. No surprise there. Everybody fell in love with Elizabeth Linley. So Mr Linley wanted to capitalise on the desirability of his daughter Elizabeth. So he looked to marry her off to one of her many suitors, preferably a wealthy one. He made an arrangement with Walter Long, who was a wealthy Wiltshire landowner. Walter Long was 60 years old. Elizabeth was 16. And when Mr Long realised how appalled Elizabeth was at the prospect of marrying him, he withdrew from the arrangement and gave Mr Linley £3,000 in compensation. That's the equivalent of about £250,000 today. But Elizabeth was not free from unwanted attention from older men. There was a Captain Matthews, a married man, a friend of the family, who pestered her continually about becoming his lover. And she got so fed up with this that she confided in Richard Brinsley Sheridan, and together they plotted a plan of escape. They plotted an elopement. On the night of the 18th of March, 1772, Elizabeth was at home in the Royal Crescent. She'd feigned illness. She said she was too ill to perform. A sedan chair arrived at the Royal Crescent and took her down to the London Road, where Sheridan was waiting in a carriage, and they went post-haste to London. From there they took a boat to France, and during the course of the journey, Sheridan professed his love for Elizabeth. he proposed to her, and although she was intending to stay in a convent when she got to France, she was so bowled over by Sheridan's proposal that she agreed, and they got married secretly in a little village near Calais. The marriage was actually invalid because they were both underage and they didn't have parental consent. So on they went to Lille, and Elizabeth did indeed stay in her convent. Meanwhile, Mr Linley, back in Bath, had heard of his daughter's whereabouts, and he set off for France. He caught up with them in Lille, dragged the pair of star-crossed lovers back to London. Now, on the night of the elopement, Sheridan had left a letter explaining the elopement on the inappropriate attentions of Captain Matthews towards Elizabeth. And when Matthews had heard of this note, he had published a letter in the Bath Chronicle denouncing Sheridan. So when Sheridan gets to London and hears of Matthews' denunciation, he challenges Matthews to a duel, which was fought in London, and the young aesthete defeats the military man. He knocks the sword out of his hand, and begging for his life, Matthews agrees to sign an apology and to have that published, which he does reluctantly. But the argument simmers on, and this leads to another duel that's fought in Bath, or rather just outside Bath, at Kingsdown at 5 o'clock in the morning. And it's a very messy affair. Both men break their swords and they're hacking at each other on the ground, and Sheridan comes off worse in this particular instance, and he suffers terrible wounds, life-threatening wounds, which takes some time to recover from. But what of the two lovers? Well, both parents have prohibited them from seeing each other, but they manage to wangle meetings and so on, and to exchange notes. There's a lovely story of them leaving letters in Delia's Grotto. That's that stone structure in the garden of Nuna's house, number 14 North Parade. They both, Richard and Elizabeth, are continually asking their parents if they can have permission to get married. And it's only when Richard becomes of age, turns 21, that Mr Linley finally consents and agrees to them getting married, which they do in April 1773, just over a year after their elopement. So after their wedding, the couple stay in London, and Sheridan pursues his ambition to become a writer. So he's quickly successful as a playwright. In 1775, his first play, The Rivals, is performed. A wonderful play, satirising the ridiculous behaviour of visitors to Bath. And in the same year, his opera The Duenna is performed with a libretto by Sheridan and the music by the two Thomas Linleys, father and son. This is a huge success. It's the most performed opera in England over the next 25 years. Lord Byron called it the greatest opera ever written. More plays follow, The Critic, The School for Scandal, etc. Sheridan actually takes over the Drury Lane Theatre from David Garrick, and he appoints his father-in-law, Thomas Linley, as the director of music. So we have the Sheridans and the Linleys working in tandem once again. At this point, Sheridan decides that he wants to start a political career. And so he becomes elected as an MP. He becomes a colleague of Charles James Fox, a fellow radical, a fellow Whig. He's an opponent, a supporter rather, of the American colonists in the War of Independence. He's a superb orator, one of the greatest orators in the House of Commons, only to be rivalled really by Edmund Burke. And his political ambitions lead him eventually to a government post. He's a minister in the Ministry of All the Talents in 1806. But what of Elizabeth? This is one of the sad parts of the story. Sheridan forbids her from singing in public, so this great voice is lost to just private parties, really, where she's performing. Which is a great sadness. But she was a very capable, very able person, Elizabeth Linley. She basically runs the theatre Drury Lane, rather than Sheridan, who was pretty hopeless at administration. And she keeps all the accounts. She auditions singers and actors. She writes a lot of Sheridan's political speeches, and she's a very, very capable person. What of their marriage? Well, again, this is a sadness. Sheridan has a number of affairs, the most long-lasting with Harriet Lady Duncannon, who is a sister to Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, who will be the subject of another Butterworth's Bath talk. And Elizabeth gets fed up with Sheridan's affairs, and in 1790 proposes a separation. She starts her own affair with Lord Edward Fitzgerald, and as a result of this relationship, a child is born, Mary. Elizabeth is very ill after the birth of this child. She's been suffering from consumption from TB for some years, and childbirth accelerates the deterioration in her health. And 3 months after the birth of the child, Elizabeth dies and is buried in Wells Cathedral with her father, Thomas Linley. Sheridan looks after the child, Mary, but sadly she also dies at the age of 18 months and is buried with her mother in Wells Cathedral. What happens to Lord Edward Fitzgerald? Well, he gets involved in the 1798 uprising against the British government, part of the United Irishmen, and he is killed resisting arrest in Dublin. Sheridan continues his political life. He dies in severe debt, actually, in 1816, and he's buried in Westminster Abbey in Poets' Corner. So we have just a wealth and a richness of stories in that long saga. I'm sure it would make a wonderful movie, if not a mini-series, and there might be an ASC alum out there willing to make it.